Star Trek's pilot episode started a negative trend that took over 50 years to break. When Star Trek first launched in 1966, its ambition was nothing short of revolutionary. With Gene Roddenberry's optimistic vision of the future, Star Trek promised a galaxy of diversity, discovery, and social commentary. But tucked beneath the groundbreaking premise of the original pilot episode, The Cage, was a subtle but significant misstep, one that would inadvertently set a precedent for the franchise and ripple through the next 5 decades: the sidelining of women in command roles. While The Cage was forward-thinking in many respects, including the introduction of a female first officer known only as Number One, played by Majel Barrett, the network balked at the idea. NBC executives reportedly found her too cold and too assertive, claiming audiences wouldn't accept a woman in a position of such high authority. The result? Barrett's character was removed, and when the show was retooled into the version we know today with Captain Kirk at the helm, Number One was gone, replaced by a male first officer, Mr. Spock, and a supporting crew that largely reflected traditional gender norms of the 1960s. This decision planted the seed for a troubling legacy. For all its progressive intentions, Star Trek consistently struggled to represent women in leadership positions for decades. It wasn't until 1995, nearly 30 years later, that Star Trek Voyager finally introduced the franchise's first female lead, Captain Catherine Janeway. And even then, her portrayal had to walk a delicate tightrope of being authoritative yet maternal, strong yet nurturing, a reflection of the ongoing discomfort with unapologetically powerful women in science fiction. The irony, of course, is that The Cage got it right the first time. Number One was composed, brilliant, and decisive, a commanding presence who operated seamlessly alongside her male peers. In many ways, she embodied the very ideals of Star Trek's future-forward philosophy. Her removal wasn't just a creative choice. It was a capitulation to mid-20th century sexism that contradicted the franchise's own message of progress. Following this course correction, Star Trek continued to feature female characters, but often in constrained or subordinate roles. Uhura, while iconic and groundbreaking in her own right, was still largely confined to communications and rarely drove the story. Dr. Beverly Crusher and Counselor Deanna Troi in The Next Generation were valued members of the crew, but not commanding officers. Even Kira Nerys and Jadzia Dax in Deep Space Nine, though strong and capable, were second to male leads. It wasn't until Janeway took center seat on the bridge of the USS Voyager that Star Trek made a real attempt to right the wrong that began in its pilot. But the delay was telling. Over 50 years from The Cage to the consistent, confident portrayal of women in command we now see in Star Trek Discovery and Strange New Worlds. Even with Janeway, however, the show's marketing and public reception often emphasized her femininity more than her leadership. Stories about her hairstyle choices, emotional moments, and maternal instincts were foregrounded, while her strategic brilliance and commanding authority were often backgrounded. She was a trailblazer, yes, but one whose trail was carefully curated to keep traditional gender expectations comfortable. In contrast, modern Star Trek has finally begun to embrace the potential that The Cage hinted at. With Star Trek Discovery's Michael Burnham Sonequa Martin Green, we see a woman of color in the leading role, not as a sidekick, not as a love interest, but as the driving force of the narrative. Her story arc, filled with triumphs and failures, command decisions, and personal growth, reflects the kind of multidimensional representation The Cage could have pioneered had it been allowed to follow through. Even more striking is the modern revival of Strange New Worlds, which reintroduces Number One, now named Una Chin Riley and played by Rebecca Romijn, and reclaims her rightful place on the bridge. No longer sidelined, this version of Number One is a fully realized, high-ranking officer, a direct refutation of the decision made back in the 1960s. It took over half a century, but Star Trek has finally corrected the course it veered from after its very first outing. This long-delayed change is more than symbolic. It shows that the franchise has evolved, not just technologically in terms of production values or storytelling structure, but ethically, finally catching up to the ideals it once dared to imagine. It's a powerful reminder that science fiction's greatest promise is not just in imagining better futures, but in confronting the flaws of the present and past. Star Trek's pilot may have started a negative trend, but the arc of the franchise, like the moral arc of the universe, bends toward justice. In reclaiming the